Now's the time when we turn within, we relax, let go. We allow ourselves to remember that all is indeed well. All is well with us. All is well in our world. All is well in God. So if you have not already done so, I invite you to lay aside anything that you may be holding in your hands. And as we breathe into this moment, as we connect ourselves with this sacred energy in this place, I also invite you to lay aside any thoughts that you may be holding. Thoughts of the past, any angers or regrets, any resentments, as well as any thought of the future, any fears, any doubts, even any hopes or dreams. Simply allow this moment to be in you, to be as you. Just breathe. Just relax. Let go. Release. Surrender. Surrender is not defeat. It is allowing all that lies under our lives to simply be there. Allowing what is to be. In this moment, our needs are met. In this moment, we are joined together in loving, sacred, spiritual community. In this moment, we can know because we feel it in the vibration around us. We breathe it in the air. We see it in the smiles. We are loved. We are supported. And we are not alone. Here this day, we see the Spirit of God in the light of others' eyes, and sometimes without even knowing it. We are that Spirit, that Christ. For someone else, it may just be a smile, a kind word, a hug, or just a touch on the arm. Being present right here, right now, for ourselves and with one another. So as we surrender to this moment, I invite you to breathe. Simply breathe and commune with the Spirit of God as it expresses as this now moment in this place with these precious souls. Just for a few moments, just for a few beats of our hearts, just for a few breaths in the silence. as we begin to allow our consciousness to move back out beyond our own skin. As we place ourselves in this room instead of the field of infinite possibilities. As we prepare to open our eyes and see each other again. We remember what it is to be here now. Not to look at one another, merely nodding our heads and thinking of the next thing we'll say, but deeply listening to what is being said now. To look at one another and to see what is really happening now. To remember that each precious moment comes once. And know that the kingdom of heaven lies only in that. Heaven is not tomorrow. Heaven is not something we left behind. It is a state of consciousness that is only now. When we relax, let go, release, surrender. As our brother and way shower Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. It is within us. For this sacred connection we have to God, to all that is, and especially to one another, we are deeply, deeply grateful. Thank you, God. Thank you, Spirit. So it is. Thank you, Deidre. Guys. Good morning, everyone. I'm Reverend Charles Perry. I'm the senior minister here at Unity of Birmingham, and I'd like to welcome you all to our Sunday service. If this is your first time with us, we are really glad you're here. If this is your first time back in a long time, welcome home. This morning, and actually for the next couple of Sundays, we're going to be continuing a series called Prosperity for You, which we kicked off last Sunday with the author of the series, Reverend Cynthia Alice Anderson. And, if you were here last week, you know why I call Alice a ball of fire. She's something special. She was my senior minister before I left to go to Unity Village. And I've learned a lot from Alice, and I continue to learn a lot from Alice. So I'm going to see if you guys learned anything from Alice. Last week, the subject of the talk was change, and she taught everybody an affirmation about change. You guys remember it? All right? Change. I like it. Bring it on, bring it on, bring it on. Let's try it together. Change. I like it. Bring it on, bring it on, bring it on. Okay. So now you're caught up from last week. What we're talking about is how these things not only affect our prosperity, but how we can use these principles to become more prosperous in our daily lives. All this stuff that we do, all these things that we talk about, we could just be sitting around Starbucks and having a cup of coffee, or we could be sitting out in the sunshine having a cup of coffee if all we were doing was talking about stuff that doesn't do anything in your life. One of the things I've always loved about Unity, even though nowadays we refer to ourselves as a positive path for spiritual living, that's the new branding. In case somebody asks you what is unity, you can say it's a positive path for spiritual living instead of saying, which is what a lot of people in unity end up doing, especially here in the Bible Belt. We don't want them to know we don't believe in Satan or hail, stuff like that. But in the old days, unity was called positive, practical Christianity. So if the things that we teach you aren't really practical, if it doesn't work out there, then there's no sense in us talking about it in here. So that's why we're talking about prosperity and about some of the principles behind it that make it work. And hopefully, I'll give you some ideas about how you can use some of these teachings to be more prosperous in your life. And when we say prosperity, we are not merely talking about how much money there is in your bank account, okay? Although that is certainly a piece of it. But prosperity, real abundance, reaches out into a lot of different areas of our lives. It's our health, our relationships, our livelihood, our sense of why we're here, our spiritual growth. You know, it reaches into a lot of different areas of our life. So today, the theme that I will be talking about in what little time I have to talk about it this morning, I'm not going to keep you over time, and what we will be talking about in the class that's going to be starting at 12:30. And if you were not in class last week, if you weren't here last week, you are still welcome to come. We still have workbooks in the bookstore. You know, please feel free to join us. I know it's a beautiful day outside, right? I get that. But there's some really great information in here, and I am not going to be able to touch on everything that Alice has in that particular chapter. But the idea is that the thing to remember is that a big energizer, a big activator of our prosperity is us giving things away. And that seems counterintuitive on the surface. But in real life, that's something that we absolutely have observed time and time again. You know, at everything from the subatomic level to the lives that we all lead. There is a book by a guy named Og Mandino, and I believe it's called The Greatest Salesman in the World. I keep forgetting whether it's the world's greatest salesman or the greatest salesman in the world. But anyway, the author's name's Og Mandino. And it's one of those books that leaves you feeling really good, you know, kind of like The Alchemist or The Little Prince or The Giving Tree. Giving Tree is another one I could probably talk about in the context of this. But in this particular book, he writes about this fellow who lives in sort of a tribal society, something not unlike what Jesus might have encountered in his life, or Muhammad, or any of those people, and quite frankly, people right now that live in places like Afghanistan, Kurdistan, and all those stands, right? Very, very tribal life. And he was not a wealthy man when he was a young man. He began his own business. And early in his career, he made a commitment that when he did a business deal, after the deal was done, he'd paid for, you know, whatever it was he had to pay for. Once he had his profit, he was going to take half of it and give it away. So from the beginning, he began giving half of his profit away to people. Now, of course, what happened to him was as time went by and he helped more and more people around him, more and more people became friends with him. They liked him. They enjoyed doing business with him. They knew that he was doing good work. Some of them had been the beneficiaries of his good work. Many of them were able to do their own things, to get launched into their own little businesses because he had helped them. And so as time went by, he got more and more and more business. And he gave more and more and more away. At the end of the novel, it describes him. He has a couple of tents that are so filled with treasure, it's almost impossible to walk through them. More things than one man could use in a lifetime. At that point in the book, he is giving away 90% of his profit. He's had to start giving more and more away because he simply has no room in his life for all that pours back into it. There's a lesson in that. And while that is kind of a fable, The truth is that there is a tremendous power in giving. Reverend Alice in Prosperity for You takes us all the way back to the subatomic level and talks about Einstein and the E equals mc squared theorem. That basically, like the physicists over in Europe right now are discovering, is that really the universe is all made up of the same stuff. Energy equals matter. And, we're finally getting to the place scientifically where we can discover this thing that we've known spiritually for a long, long time. It's all the same stuff. Charles Fillmore used to call that subatomic particle, whatever it is, substance. Right? So the idea is that this substance responds to spiritual law as much as it responds to the kind of laws the physicists are currently trying to discover over there in CERN. Right? Now here's the thing. What I think we're going to find as science continues to advance is that physics and metaphysics become one discipline. Amen? So here's the deal. What we have to do is discover how we can take advantage of those spiritual, metaphysical, and physical laws and enable prosperity to freely flow in our lives. So there are several different ways that we activate this. Now, Alice talks about the law of cause and effect, and other prosperity teachers will refer to this phenomenon either by that, or they may say the law of circulation or the law of giving and receiving, but essentially we're talking about the same thing. And she mentions Newton's third law of motion. It says for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Now, we understand now that Newtonian physics is not exactly right on all the time. What I would say is that for every action, there tends to be a nearly equal and corresponding reaction. Because sometimes we might give something away and have even more come our way, and not in the opposite direction, but from an entirely different direction that we never expected. And I know that's happened in my life quite a lot. David Owen Ritz, who wrote The Keys to the Kingdom. How many of you guys were here when I did The Keys to the Kingdom before, right? All right, does anybody remember the first key? All right, so maybe we could do that again like next year. It's a little refresher. And for all those of you who didn't raise your hand because you weren't here when we did it before, you're in for a real treat. First key to the kingdom is making a commitment to being a giver to life. And there's a reason that's the first key, right? We have to really decide, yes, this stuff is going to work and I'm going to do it. All right, but there are a lot of different ways that we can activate that, a lot of different ways of getting into that flow of giving and receiving, or as Alice says, that cause and effect. So one of my other favorite prosperity teachers is Reverend Edwene Gaines, who lives up in Valley Head, Alabama. And we try to have her in here at least once a year just because she's a lot of fun. And she's also spot on. I was just up at a minister's retreat up at her place the week after Easter and really, got a little kick in my prosperity pants. And so I really enjoy Edwene. So when she is about to talk about what we're about to talk about, she likes to say, when you're required to swallow several live frogs, it's best to swallow the biggest one first. So today we have a few things to talk about. I'm not sure I'm going to get to all of them, but the first thing we'll talk about is tithing, because that's the biggest frog, right, of the things that we'll talk about today. Although for some people, forgiveness might be a pretty big frog, right? I won't name any names. So in terms of getting into that flow of giving and receiving, one of the tools that we have, one of the practices that we have been practicing for a long, long time is tithing. And I know that when I say that word, some of you are inwardly wincing, aren't you? Right? Some of you have probably been beaten up with that word in the faiths of your upbringing. I can remember when I was a kid in the Baptist church, not to mention any names, oops. the deacon's coming around to my house with the box full of envelopes, right? And trying to make some very pointed points about what that was supposed to happen with those little envelopes. And I know that there are people here, in this church who, when they were growing up, probably didn't get things. They probably, went without a little bit because their parents insisted on putting, a tenth in that envelope because they felt they were obligated to do so. Obligation doesn't work with tithing, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But first I want to talk about, where does this come from? Why do we do it? Well, tithing is something that we inherited from the Judaic tradition. And while most people will teach that verse in Malachi about bring a full tithe into the warehouse and see if I will not, open up the windows of heaven and pour out an overwhelming blessing. That's pretty late in the Hebrew Scriptures. In fact, it's like just about the last book in the Hebrew Scriptures. Where that practice, where we always talk about it coming from, is when the tribes of Israel divided up the promised land. They did not give any land to the Levites because they were the holy people, the priests, the rabbis. And everyone else said, we're going to give 1/10 to them of our first fruits. And, they said that we're going to take care of the people who are taking care of us spiritually. But there's even further back, way back in the Bible, this practice is talked about even before Israel became a nation. And what is interesting is we're talking about Abram before he became Abraham, right? The father of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Well, there's, at the beginning of Genesis chapter 14, it kind of describes this raiding party. And they said that these kings, which really means some tribal chiefs, right, had gone off and they'd raided these other tribal chiefs. And among the people that they took with them was Lot. And you may remember him from a story that happens a little later on. He lives in Sodom, right? And you remember the story about his wife, okay? Well, before all that happens, he gets kidnapped and all of his stuff gets taken in this raid. I'm not going to name you all the names and stuff in there. It's a bunch of stuff nobody will understand. But the bottom line is his uncle Abram takes a bunch of his dudes and they go after him to rescue him. Well, on the way back, and they rescue him and they get all their stuff back. On the way back, they meet the guy who happens to be the king of Salem, which later on becomes Jerusalem, right? This guy also happens to be a priest. And he blesses them with, and this sounds familiar, bread and wine. This is Genesis. Okay, this is recording events that, may have taken place, 2,700, 2,800 years ago. He blesses them with bread and wine, and Abram gives him 1/10 of all that he has. So that tradition of giving 1/10 back to where we're spiritually fed is really, really, really old. All right? That's where it comes from. But what a lot of us don't understand is, why does it work? Now, I know a lot of folks say, well, it works real well for you because you're the minister. Right? That's how you get paid. Right? A lot of ministers don't like teaching tithing because of that. But I have a duty to you. Right? It's my duty to tell you the things the spiritual principles that have worked for me and that continue to work for me. And if I don't do that, even if it's a little fearful sometimes, I'm not doing my job. I tithe because it works for me. And here is what it's about. Charles Fillmore says that he says that faith is the perceiving power of the mind linked to the ability to shape substance. Okay? the perceiving power of the mind linked to the ability to shape substance. Now, we know that the observer effect is a real thing. We can take a wave and turn it into a particle. We can take a particle and turn it into a wave by the perceiving power of our mind. Jesus said to so many people, your faith has made you whole. Right? Faith, probably more important than anything else in our ability to manifest prosperity. What tithing is like spiritual weightlifting for faith. Tithing makes your faith stronger, makes my faith stronger. I know it does, because I've been doing it for a long, long time. True story. Back when I first knew Alice, she came to Christ Church Unity in late 2007. She actually got there in early 2008. I was the treasurer. And then in 2009, she made me her associate minister. So a little later in 2009, I and about 16 of my coworkers were all laid off. We were all senior people. We were all on the old, tier benefits. So I lost my civilian job, which was the lion's share of my income. Now, at the time, I was not fully tithing. I was probably giving maybe 5% of my income. I mean, it was still, with the exception of my mortgage payment, the largest check I wrote every month. But I wasn't fully tithing. And I knew I needed to, because Alice taught tithing the way that she does now. And I kind of felt uncomfortable being up there with her when she's talking about tithing and I'm not actually dropping a zero, right? So I get laid off. And, my income drops really dramatically. And I decided, okay, desperate times call for desperate measures. And I started tithing. Now, at that time, I was in debt probably, $350,000. Upside down on a house in Florida by maybe half that, about $150,000, something like that. And, had very little income coming in. It did not look good. But I knew that I was going to need to up my game in faith in order to took us out of that mess that I was in. Within 3 years, every debt I had was paid. I no longer owned that toxic property in Florida. And I was at Unity Village with enough money in the bank to get all the way through school. I've been tithing ever since, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And in fact, like Alice now, I've started adding another % to my tithe. I'm tithing on my tithe and throwing that in there too, just because I can't outgive the universe. And I've been trying, right? I haven't managed yet. Good things have happened in my life. And I'm looking at some people that I know have had good things happen in their life since they've been tithing. I don't think it's any accident that some of the people who tithe in this church that I know are some of the most successful people in this church, right? Monetarily. And they don't tithe because they're successful monetarily, folks. I guarantee it. They became successful because they had enough faith that God would support them in living the life of their dreams and fulfilling their mission here in this lifetime. So they're out there doing that. And they're being really well compensated for that. It's about building faith. It's about being able to reach out into the invisible and make it visible. And the way that we do that is by faith. And the way that we grow that faith is by tithing. It's pretty simple. It's real simple. Now, going back to the how we tithe, all right? The means that we do it, the heart that we have while we do it actually matters. I love what Paul writes in 2 Corinthians. What he says, and this is 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 7. How we give. Okay, we don't give like, okay, here's my check, now I expect some money, right? It's not like pushing a button. It's not like going to the ATM. All right, I put in my 4-digit code. I expect a couple $100 to come out. You owe me, God. That's not the consciousness that works, right? And it also doesn't work like, jeez, I can't believe this. Wow. Okay. All right, let me get okay? That's not going to grow your faith, all right? That doesn't do it. So this is what Paul has to say, writing to the folks in Corinth. He says, each of you must give as you have made up your mind, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. Not reluctantly or under compulsion. For God loves a cheerful giver. The universe loves, supports, gives to someone who gives in a consciousness of joy. Right? When you're able to give something to your kids, you know how that feels? Right? How joyful it is to watch their faces light up. That's the spirit that we need to be tithing in. That's the spirit we need to be doing all of our service in. Not feeling obligated, not feeling compelled, but in a spirit of joy. That's when the universe loves us. That's when the universe reaches out with both hands and shoves more back to us. That's what prompts it. So when we combine the faith that God is our source, my job is not my source, my parents are not my source, my spouse is not my source, no one thing is my source. God in all things is my source. And very often when I least expect it, my source shows up. So last year, we are coming into the last month of the year, and the church was about $40,000 in the hole going into December. Now, we always do very well in December because we have extra services, and people do a lot of end of the year, I'd rather render unto God than to render unto Caesar, so I'm going to write another big check to the church, right? That happens. It's historical. So I knew that we would probably end up about 20 grand, income over expenses in December, which, if I looked at things historically, we were probably going to end up down about 20 grand for the year. And in a year when we lost one of our ministers, quite frankly, that's okay. We can live with that. We can absorb that. Last night of the year, New Year's Eve, we got one check, one tithe for just under $32,000. The reason we got that check is because I practice tithing and I teach tithing. Interesting fact, the church made about $318,000 last year. That one check paid for every tithe that this church sent out. And we still ended up about $9,000 to the good last year. Had no idea that it was coming in. It was not someone I would have expected to do that. We have to be willing to allow God to show up in new and different ways for us. And the way that we make that happen is by having faith. The best way I've found to grow my faith is by tithing. Now, when I talk about tithing, I don't just talk about tithing money. I like to use yet another one of our prosperity systems, which is called the 4 T's, which talks about tithing of our time and our talent. Now, in Prosperity for You, Alice talks about tithing of, and this is for those of you that might want to pick it up at the bookstore, this is it. Alice talks about tithing of time in the way that I normally talk about tithing of our talent. and that is giving of our time, without any idea of being recompensed to someone, somewhere. Whether it's volunteering here at the church or going out into the community and doing things, or just simply doing something nice for someone who's not expecting it. I was on the way home from Joint Force headquarters yesterday, and telling on myself, I stopped at Dairy Queen. And I go to pay for my check, and a woman rushes up to the counter and says, "I'm paying for that." I was like, "Oh, no, ma'am, you can't, no thank you." And she's like, "No, I'm paying for that." So I look at the girl behind the counter, and she's like, "I don't argue with a lady." Okay, good point. But simply going out and being of service in some way or another. And, for some people, that's the best way they can do it. Some of us aren't really talented. Some of us can't knit prayer shawls, well, in theory, yeah. In theory. It's just, I don't know if I could do that so well. But anyway, Yes, I am. All right. So, bring it on. Yeah, change. I like it. Bring it on, bring it on, bring it on. All right. In all my spare time, I will learn how to crochet. That's right. Yeah. She's laughing because she's been a minister too. There is no spare time. It's like the mail. It just never stops. Just never. Yeah, that's right. And that's a good thing. That's a very good thing. But that being of service is also, it's a tremendous way of putting us in the flow. And as those of you who have been of service, as those of you who are volunteering, giving of yourselves in some way, know that may be the best, hour or 2 hours or 4 hours of your week. If you're somebody who's able to volunteer all the time, you know how fulfilling that is. Even though I'm not a volunteer, I live a life of service. And I let go of everything when I became a minister. I let go of my home. I let go of my old profession. And, all that money that I managed to get after I had gotten out of debt, I spent every last penny of it finishing off my master's in divinity. Because I just knew, I'm going to be taken care of one way or the other. If I'm willing to live in service, God will take care of me. I don't know where and I don't know how. And I'll be honest with you, Birmingham, Alabama is the last place on earth I thought I would end up. It's where ex-wife number 2 is from. Had no intention of ever coming here. Really. Oh. And here I am in the church that she learned about unity from all those years ago before she turned me on to unity. I'm giving back in a very real way. And I cannot tell you the rewards that my heart has felt from doing it. It's been an amazing, amazing time. And it will continue to be amazing for a long time, I hope. There are so many different ways that we can move that energy along. There are a couple of other subjects that I could just about do I could do a couple of sermons on, that Alice talks about. Forgiveness, right? If we have not forgiven something or someone, then we have a very stuck energy in our consciousness and in our hearts. And until we are able to forgive that person or thing or institution, we're blocking the flow of Spirit's good through us. She also talks about literally clearing out our spaces, getting rid of those things that we no longer need, those things that no longer serve us. And I'm reminded, again, telling on myself, I'm going to have to clean some stuff from my marriage out of my house, because I'm starting to wake up again. And in order to make room, I have to make space. So I've got to get some of those, old things from, old wedding presents and box them up and do something with them. Clear it out and make some energy. Make room for the new. Some people are hoarders, right? But I think those of you who enjoy cleaning and moving things out know that the more you clean things out, the more something else shows up. And now it's like, oh, well, look at this new thing I just got. Wow, isn't that cool? It's an amazing thing. I'll say it again, there's no way that we can outgive the universe. We simply cannot outgive God. And the wonderful thing about that is not only does the practice make us more prosperous, like the world's greatest salesman, but it makes us feel a way that we could never feel any other way. I think about people who are addicted to money. The billionaires who are doing their best to make sure that they always remain at the top. I know what it's like to be an addict. I've been there and done that. And it's very empty. There's never enough. I know that feeling. And yet I have met people who are a long way from being billionaires. But like George in It's a Wonderful Life, they're the richest people I know because they have a heart for giving. And they live in that joy of knowing what it feels like to give to their children, to their friends, to their neighbors, to their community. I want all that for you. I want us all to be able to live in that joy of giving, and to know what it's like when we try to outgive the universe. Because we can't. Please join me in prayer. Sweet, generous Spirit, we are so grateful for all of your abundant blessings in our lives. Simply to have the consciousness, to know how good it is to give, to be given that feeling of joy and love, to know what it's like to be a giver to life, and to have faith, to know that no matter how much we give, you are there ready to hand us even more, even more, even more. Today we commit ourselves to living in that flow of cause and effect, of giving and receiving, of knowing your divine abundance. By giving to where we are spiritually fed, by forgiving those in our lives, especially ourselves, who need it most. By making space, by being of service. For this and for all the ways that we are blessed to give, which open us up to all the ways we are blessed to receive. We say thank you. Thank you, God.